Hi class, this is Mr. Gilbert, just giving you guys a little demo on making lines, and then we're going to go through and explore some of the different media that you guys have in your kits. So we'll take a look at the black gouache and the brushes that you have, okay, and then of course this little tray comes in handy for mixing as like a little palette. You know, it's funny, I almost never buy these. Because I find it just as useful to use like we get this, you know, yogurt that comes in a larger container, and so the yogurt container becomes, you know, a water reservoir, and then these become little mixing palettes, and you know, that way I don't have to spend a bunch of money on these, although they are pretty handy to have. But just so you know, you can always go DIY at home. Alright, so anyway, let's get into how lines work, right? So line is basically a dot in motion. So let's take a pencil here. Okay, we'll start with a 4H. So a dot in motion. So there's my dot, and I can move it and give it a direction, right? This is just real basic. I always find there's different ways of holding the pencil will give you different, you know, ways. This is sort of a writing kind of feel, and that's good for just using the fingertips to make small marks. And if we move all those marks together in the same direction, we get a sort of line. I'm going to switch to the 2B so that you can see a little more what's happening. So that's probably kind of hard to see. That's one way to hold the pencil, but you know, there's other ways, and it kind of affects the way that you make your marks. Okay. If I use the whole arm from the shoulder, then I get a certain kind of mark, and if I use just from the elbow, I get a little different mark, or just the wrist. And if I'm using just the fingers, I can get real detailed and create my lines that way. Okay. So think about using your whole body sometimes. I know if you work in a really large scale, eventually you may be able to use your whole body to make marks. If you get a chance, look up the work of a conceptual artist named Tom Marioni, and he did this piece where he held a drawing tool next to his hip, and then as he walked past the piece that was hanging on the wall, he hung a big drawing paper on the wall, and then he put the drawing tool attached to his hip with his hand like that, and then as he's walking, it would make these undulating lines as he was moving across, and he did this over and over again. It's just a really beautiful piece. That's kind of what it looked like. Okay, so another way to make lines, we got the pencils, which make sort of a soft gray line. We've also got these micron pens, which are really nice, in 3 different sizes. So we'll take a look at those. So of course the smallest one is going to make the thinnest line. Okay. So let's just compare those. Let's compare how those lines look. So that's the thinnest one. And we've got a number 3. It's a little bit thicker, and then a number 5. This is all just what came in your kit. I have a few others that I've collected over the years. Where did it go? Let's see here. Yeah, these are kind of fun. So number 2, let's try this one. This is a chisel tip. So depending on which orientation you choose, you could get a line that's fairly thin, or you could turn it sideways and get a much thicker line. And you can see how the different thicknesses create a spatial illusion when they're next to each other. So this line here appears the furthest away from us because it's so thin, and then as we get closer and closer, the lines sort of get beefier and beefier. So that's a spatial trick you can use if you're drawing, say, a figure, and for example, you've got the area of the face that's closer to you, you might have thicker lines, and the area that's further away might have the thinner lines. here we've got thicker lines. And it's just enough of a spatial illusion to help make you think that this area is closer than that further away area. Okay, let's see, where's that thin one again? So then that eye is made up of thinner lines. So the different thicknesses of lines can sort of contribute to the spatial illusion there a little bit. Okay, that's just really roughed in. All right, so that's kind of how that works. So the eyebrow would be a little thinner there and a little thicker, heavier here. So that's just one way you can use lines to just create space, all right? And that's using the micron pens with different sizes. And then when you get into it, you can buy some that have a chisel tip or a brush tip. And then those are really fun to play with. The chisel tip is kind of neat because as you're drawing a line, let me see if I can find it here. Chisel tip. Yeah. So as you're drawing a line, you can change the orientation and make the line sort of taper and swell. So it goes from thin to thick and then back to thin. Okay, so you can control it that way to give it a little more interest. Okay. Thick lines and then thin lines all mixed together. Gives it a little more character than just a solid line, okay? And then, let's see what else we got here. We got the pencils, the micron. The colored pencils you could even use. Different colors will have different sort of feelings to them. But let's move on to the gouache here, because this is kind of another tool that can be very expressive with line, is the water media, okay? So gouache, in case you're not familiar with it, it's a type of, let's see, this one says acrylic polymer. Usually a gouache is a lot like a watercolor, except that it has what they call an opacifier in it, which means that there's a substance in there that makes, instead of transparency, you get opacity. So you could take normal watercolor, you'd put down a red, and then if you went over it with a yellow, it would just sort of mix and become orange because of the transparency. With gouache, you could put down a red and then put a layer of yellow over it, and the yellow would completely cover up what's underneath. It'd be opaque. Okay, so another way to describe it is gouache is just opaque watercolors. This particular one that's in your kit says it's an acrylic polymer, which means that it may have a plasticizer in it, which is okay for what we're going to do. But if you're ever going to use gouache, a set of gouache colors, and you want to mix it with watercolor, you probably want to try to avoid the acrylic polymer ones. What can happen is, as an acrylic, once it dries, it becomes permanent, which is a good thing in some ways. But the nice thing about gouache and watercolor is that you can re-wet them and rework them later. And the acrylic just sort of kills that advantage. So just something to think about. This is great for what we're going to do, but in the future you may not necessarily want to do that. The other thing is it's a little more economical. If this stuff dries and you can't re-wet it, then whatever's left in my palette is sort of wasted at the end. Whereas like a regular watercolor or a traditional gouache, once it's dry on the palette, you just add water to it and it reactivates and you can reuse it. Okay, so let's try a little bit of this stuff, this black gouache paint. And we got two different brushes. You've got your traditional round, and the round comes to a very fine tip. So depending on how heavily you're applying pressure, you can get different weights of lines. So always wet the brush before you go into the paint, because otherwise if you go from a dry brush directly into the paint, it'll suck up the paint deep into the ferrule and it'll be very hard to get that out. But if we have a layer of water in there, it's a lot easier to get it completely clean, and then your brush will last a really long time. This is a nice brush, so make sure you take good care of it. Okay, so wet the bristles first. And And then we're just going to sort of dip it into the paint a little bit. That's about all you need, okay? So our line work, again, if we just barely touch the paper, get a very thin, controlled line. And if we press a little more hard, then we can make it go into a thick area. So we can make it go from thick to thin, a lot like the chisel tip marker. And I usually keep a scratch paper next to me so that I can always test my brush stroke first. I can just make sure that it's flowing the way I want it to before I go into the actual piece. Okay. And you can see how it also tails off and you get the sort of dry brush effect. That's kind of a nice thing if you can learn to control that. Another neat effect is with water-based media. You can make soft edges, or it can soften your line if you apply a little bit of moisture first. And now when we go in, you'll see this becomes a little bit, it should sort of bleed. Actually, this acrylic stuff isn't bleeding like it normally would. So normally that the wetness on the paper maybe just got too dry. Let's try that again. So we'll soak the paper a little bit, and then we should get a nice, yeah, there we go, starting to become softer. Has sort of a fuzzy, softer edge to it. And spatially what happens is the sharper one looks like it's in focus, it's hovering above the sort of shadowy, soft lines. It's kind of a neat effect. And if this is really nice gouache, we should be able to reactivate that even more and soften it with our other brush. There we go. Becomes nice and soft and fuzzy. So now we have that illusion of this line hovering in space, casting a shadow onto a surface below. It's kind of nice. You notice how I painted those diagonally. That's kind of the way that my arm wanted to work. And if I want to control my lines, I'll oftentimes rotate the piece so that the orientation I'm painting or drawing goes in the natural direction. Instead of trying to maneuver around this way and then it becomes real awkward and hard to control, I'll move the piece, and that way my natural motion, the way that my body works, is going in the orientation that I want it to go. So I'm just sort of painting a network of interlocking lines here. Might make some of them fuzzy and some of them sharper. This is kind of a nice brush too. We can get a really broad stroke with that, or we can turn it sideways and get very fine strokes. Okay. We can dab with it. Can make this really energetic line based on the shape of the brush. Okay. And then, like I said, if you want to go a different direction, turn the piece. Don't turn your body or try to do something awkwardly. Make it ergonomically simple for you. And that way all of your strokes will have a very similar kind of authoritative, confident quality to them. When doing circles, I just like to use, just sort of a natural circular motion. Sort of let it happen. Be confident with it. If you get too hung up on making it perfect, it's going to look awkward. So just embrace the fact that this is handmade, and that my lines and circles aren't going to be perfect. They're not. I'm not a computer, and I don't want the work to look like a computer, because this is about being handmade. That's a nice effect. Okay, so Let's see, what else do I want to cover? Okay, so when you're using lines as a network, we can build up other things like shapes and tones. So a shape is just an enclosure of lines. So if I make let's say I'm making a diagonal sort of square shape, a rhombus or something, then it's just a series of lines that enclose, and they can have different qualities too. This one could be thicker on this side. Maybe that one's a little more scratchy. And then this last one. Go with this brush, give it a little character. Okay, so a shape is just an enclosure of lines, so the lines define the edges. You can also make tones happen with just lines. So I can make shapes happen, I can make tone happen with just lines. So if I make a network of lines and I keep them thin and kind of spaced further apart, and I'm creating sort of an area of very light tone or value. So it's kind of like shading, except it's a network of lines called hatching. So this is a hatching stroke. And again, I'm orienting the piece the way I want, my natural movement of my wrist to go. So if I want to change direction of the hatching strokes, I need to rotate my piece a little bit. And that way I can get cross hatching. So when the hatching marks cross one another like that, then you get something that artists call cross hatching. And that creates an area of shadow or tone. Keep going here. So if they're spaced fairly far apart, then it creates a very light tone. So if I do this and extend these out, okay, so this is an area of light tone and very light tone here, and then a sort of a lighter tone, and then it gets to a medium. And then if we use more of them and space them closer together, we can make that tone get darker and darker and darker. Set those down for a minute. Let's go with the micron pen. Nope, not that one. Here we go. This is the number 5. This is kind of a neat pen to do cross hatching with, so let's do some cross hatching. So the hatching marks create an area of changing tone based on how close or far apart the strokes become. And you can build up tone with sort of these very regular marks, or we could do it through sort of irregular marks. We could sort of use a network of scribbles, and that creates a completely different feeling. So the scribbles get looser and further apart, and the tone becomes lighter, and if they get dense, the dense tangle of lines become darker and darker. And you can see how it creates a completely different emotional response or different feeling. Okay, or we could, use a different pen here. Let's use the pencil. Let's go with a pencil here. And I can use these sort of repeated M shapes. Jasper Johns did a lot of interesting drawings using this sort of repeated M shape to build up his areas of tone. Sort of energetic wrist movements. And see how that's got a different feeling than if I use sort of neat, regular strokes to build up tone. And of course my pencil's getting very dull, and so the quality of the line kind of is degrading. Unless you really like that sort of fatter, looser look, I'd probably sharpen my pencil a little bit more often. then the sharp edge of the pencil leaves a completely different mark than the rounded sort of smooth edge. So you want to control for that too. So you can see like a completely different feeling here between these two styles of mark making. And then of course, you can make very short strokes and give everything sort of a texture. And of course we can change direction. It's almost like a stippling. You can do dots and things. Like stippling with the brush is kind of fun. So if I put my short little dabs close together, they get very dark, and if I space them apart, then we start to have lighter tones. And this creates this, texture. Gives the piece a certain texture and feeling. Okay, so that's the mark, that's the line. Hope you guys, have fun with it and kind of explore it. There's a lot of different line quality. There's dry brush, there's stuff that's washed out. Some very fuzzy lines. Okay, and very authoritative short strokes that make this sort of line going this way. So the line goes this way, the strokes go that way. That's kind of interesting too. Thicker and thinner. All right. Remember to turn the page so you can continue. All right, and then when you clean your brushes, it should just be soap and water is all you need to clean this stuff up. And make sure they're, when you store them so that they're sitting upright. Don't store them bristle down, or you'll end up bending the hairs, and then you'll never really have a good brush after that. So take good care of these brushes. These are pretty nice. Should last you, 10, 20 years if you take good care of them. And these will work for just about any kind of water media. I'm not sure I'd use them for oil painting. But I suppose certain types of oil painting, you might be able to use this one here. Okay? All right. Thanks, guys.